My mother-in-law humiliated me at our anniversary dinner because I reached for the food before she did. Know your place in this family, she announced with a smile that never reached her eyes, making sure every guest heard every word. The clinking of silverware stopped. Conversations died in an instant. Every face around the beautifully decorated table turned toward me, waiting to see if I would shrink into the silence they had grown used to. My husband stared at his plate instead of at me. I felt the familiar sting of embarrassment, but this time something inside me stayed strangely calm. I slowly placed my untouched plate back onto the table. Then I stood. The sound of my hand striking her cheek echoed through the dining room. No one moved. No one breathed. Her hand flew to her face, more shocked than hurt. The room froze beneath the warm chandelier. Lights as glasses remained suspended, halfway to lips. My husband finally looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief, as if he had forgotten I was capable of defending myself. They all thought that slap was the moment I lost control. They were wrong. It was the moment I stopped pretending that years of insults, public humiliation, and carefully disguised cruelty were acceptable. That single slap wasn't an explosion of anger. It was the closing sentence of a story they had been writing about me for far too long. And none of them knew that. Everything waiting after that moment would leave them far more speechless than the slap itself. My name is Claire, and by the time our 5th wedding anniversary arrived, I had become an expert at swallowing words that should have been spoken years earlier. From the outside, my life looked comfortable. My husband, Daniel, had a respected career. We owned a beautiful home, and every holiday was celebrated with elaborate family gatherings. People assumed I was lucky. They never saw what happened between those celebrations. My mother-in-law, Evelyn, had a remarkable talent for disguising cruelty as tradition. Every criticism came wrapped in a pleasant smile. If I cooked, she would explain how Daniel preferred her recipes. If I decorated our home, she reminded everyone that her taste had inspired everything worthwhile. If I succeeded at work, she joked that I finally had something to keep me busy besides trying to be part of the family. Everyone laughed, including my husband. That hurt more than her words ever could. Daniel wasn't a cruel man, at least not in the obvious way. He simply believed that keeping the peace meant asking me to tolerate whatever his mother did. Whenever I tried to explain how deeply her comments affected me, he sighed and repeated the same sentence. That's just how Mom is. Over time, those 6 words became permission for everyone else to ignore my feelings. I started questioning myself instead. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I expected too much respect. Maybe being accepted into this family really did require staying quiet. So I smiled through birthdays, anniversaries, and Sunday dinners. I helped prepare meals I was barely invited to enjoy. I bought thoughtful gifts for people who rarely thanked me. I remembered everyone's important dates while mine were forgotten unless Daniel reminded them. The strange thing about being underestimated is that people stop noticing you altogether. They stop wondering what you're thinking. They assume you'll always forgive, always compromise, and always remain exactly where they've placed you. That was Evelyn's greatest mistake. She believed silence meant weakness. She never considered that silence can also be patience, and that patient people notice everything. The anniversary dinner wasn't the beginning of Evelyn's disrespect. It was simply the first time everyone else was forced to see it without looking away. In the months leading up to that evening, the insults had become quieter, sharper, and more deliberate. She had learned that the deepest wounds weren't made with raised voices. They were made with carefully chosen words delivered at exactly the right moment. When relatives visited our home, she would inspect everything with slow, thoughtful eyes before finding something to criticize. "The curtains are lovely," she'd say, pausing just long enough to smile. "They're not what Daniel usually likes. But I suppose compromise is part of marriage." The room would fill with polite laughter. Daniel never corrected her. At family dinners, she made sure I served everyone else before I was allowed to sit down. If I reached for a dish, she'd gently slide it away, pretending someone else needed it first. If I offered an opinion, she would wait a heartbeat before speaking over me, redirecting the conversation as though I had never opened my mouth. The others noticed. I could tell by the quick glances they exchanged and the awkward silence that followed. Yet no one challenged her. It was easier to pretend nothing unusual had happened than to confront the woman who controlled every family gathering. Daniel's silence slowly became its own kind of betrayal. On the drive home after each visit, he would squeeze the steering wheel and avoid looking at me. "You know she doesn't mean it that way," he'd say softly. I stopped answering. Instead, I started paying attention. I noticed who laughed because they agreed with her and who laughed because they were uncomfortable. I noticed which relatives quietly apologized with sympathetic smiles when Evelyn wasn't looking. Most importantly, I noticed that every insult happened only when she had an audience. She wasn't trying to correct me. She was performing. By the time our anniversary arrived, I realized something that changed everything. Evelyn didn't need me to fail. She needed everyone else to believe I already had. That dinner wasn't meant to celebrate our marriage. It was meant to remind me, one more time, exactly where she believed my place was. She had no idea. I had already decided that would be the last performance she ever directed at my expense. As the silence settled over the dining room after the slap, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. For years, I had imagined standing up to Evelyn in 100 different ways. I thought I would cry, yell, or finally unload every hurt she had caused. Instead, I felt almost detached, as if I were watching the end of a chapter that should have closed long ago. Evelyn slowly lowered her hand from her cheek. "How dare you?" she whispered. "No," I replied, my voice steady enough that even I barely recognized it. "The real question is why everyone here believed you could keep treating me this way." No one interrupted. I turned to Daniel. "I've spent 5 years asking you to stand beside me. I wasn't asking you to choose between your mother and your wife. I was asking you to tell the truth when someone was being cruel." He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. That silence answered every question I had been avoiding. In that moment, I understood something painful but freeing. Evelyn had created the hostility, but Daniel had protected it. Every excuse, every nervous smile, every quiet request for me to let it go had allowed her behavior to become normal. The slap hadn't changed my marriage. It had simply exposed what it had already become. I reached into my handbag and placed a neatly folded envelope on the table. "I came tonight hoping this family would surprise me," I said. "Instead, you reminded me exactly why I prepared this." Inside the envelope were copies of the apartment lease I had signed 2 weeks earlier, my resignation from the family business that Evelyn constantly used to control me, and a letter informing Daniel that I was moving out the following morning. I hadn't made those decisions in anger. I had made them after months of quiet planning, careful saving, and accepting a difficult truth. Respect cannot be begged for. It has to exist willingly, or you have to walk away. The slap was never my revenge. It was the line that told everyone the performance was over, and this time I would not be taking my old role back. People assumed the slap was my revenge because it was the only part they witnessed. The real work had begun months earlier, in complete silence. After one particularly humiliating family dinner, I stopped arguing with Daniel. I stopped trying to convince Evelyn to treat me with respect. Instead, I began preparing for a future that didn't depend on either of them changing. As a financial analyst, planning was second nature to me. I trusted facts more than promises. I opened a separate savings account in my own name, carefully tracking every expense and building an emergency fund large, enough to support myself for a year. I reviewed every document connected to our finances, making copies of tax records, insurance policies, property paperwork, and employment agreements. Everything was organized, dated, and stored securely. I also scheduled consultations with a family law attorney, not because I had already decided to end my marriage, but because I wanted to understand my rights before emotions clouded my judgment. The attorney gave me practical advice, explained what documents I should keep, and reminded me that preparation wasn't betrayal. It was responsibility. At work, I quietly accepted a promotion that required transferring to another office across the city. I never mentioned it to Evelyn because I knew she would try to undermine the opportunity before I even began. I rebuilt friendships I had neglected while trying to please Daniel's family. One by one, I reconnected with people who valued me without asking me to earn the privilege. They never pushed me toward a decision. They simply reminded me what respect felt like. By the time our anniversary dinner arrived, every important choice had already been made. The apartment lease was signed. My personal finances were secure. My career was stronger than ever. The only decision left was whether Daniel would finally stand beside me when it mattered most. When he lowered his eyes instead of his mother's voice, he answered that question for me. I didn't need another argument. I simply needed to follow the plan I had already built, one careful step at a time. The morning after the anniversary dinner, I left before sunrise. The house was silent except for the soft click of my suitcase, wheels across the hardwood floor. I didn't slam doors or leave an angry note. My wedding ring rested neatly on the kitchen counter beside a handwritten letter that contained only one sentence. I finally know my place, and it isn't, where I'm tolerated instead of respected. By the time Daniel woke up, I was already settling into my new apartment. My phone rang repeatedly throughout the morning. I let every call go to voicemail. The first messages came from Daniel, confused and apologetic. Then came Evelyn's, demanding that I stop embarrassing the family and return home before relatives started asking questions. Her greatest concern wasn't what had happened, it was who might hear about it. I answered neither of them. Instead, I sent one calm email to Daniel. I told him all future conversations about our marriage would happen through scheduled meetings or our attorneys if necessary. There would be no late-night arguments, no emotional bargaining, and no more conversations where his mother's opinions outweighed my dignity. For the first time in years, the boundaries were mine. Within days, word of the anniversary dinner spread through the extended family. I expected people to condemn me for the slap. Some did, but something unexpected happened. Several relatives quietly reached out to me. One cousin admitted she had watched Evelyn belittle people for years but had never found the courage to speak. An aunt apologized for laughing at jokes she never thought were funny. Even Daniel's younger brother confessed that everyone had learned it was easier to stay silent than challenge Evelyn. The image she had spent decades protecting began to crack, not because I exposed her, but because people finally stopped pretending they hadn't seen the truth. I never chased revenge. I simply refused to participate in the lie any longer. And once I walked away, everyone else had to decide whether they would keep protecting her or finally face the silence they had mistaken for my weakness. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. There were no dramatic confrontations at my door, no relatives demanding that I apologize. Real life rarely unfolds that way. Instead, the consequences arrived in small, undeniable moments that revealed who people truly were when the audience disappeared. Daniel asked to meet several times. When we finally sat across from each other in a quiet cafe, he looked exhausted. "I should have defended you years ago," he admitted. For the first time, I believed he meant it. But regret and repair are not the same thing. I told him I appreciated his honesty. Yet I also explained that trust isn't restored by a single apology. It is rebuilt through consistent choices, and I no longer had the strength to wait for promises that might never become actions. He nodded, knowing there was nothing left to argue. Meanwhile, Evelyn's influence over the family began to fade. Without me quietly absorbing every insult, her behavior became impossible to disguise. Relatives who once laughed politely now changed the subject or left the room. Some visited me privately, admitting they had mistaken my silence for acceptance when, in reality, it had been endurance. That realization embarrassed them more than anything I could have said. As for me, the greatest change wasn't where I lived or whether my marriage survived. It was how I saw myself. For years, I measured my worth by how well I could keep everyone else comfortable. I believed being a good wife meant sacrificing my own dignity whenever conflict appeared. Walking away forced me to replace that belief with something healthier. Respect begins with the boundaries we are willing to protect. That's why this story matters. Most people will never experience a dramatic public confrontation. But many know what it feels like to be dismissed, overlooked, or expected to stay quiet for the sake of someone else's comfort. The hardest lesson isn't learning how to confront cruelty. It's realizing that every silent compromise teaches people how they are allowed to treat you. The day I stopped accepting that lesson was the day my life finally began to change. Months later, I sometimes think about that anniversary dinner, not because I regret what happened, but because I remember the woman I was before that night. The woman who measured every word, apologized for things she didn't do, and believed keeping peace was more important than protecting her own dignity. I don't recognize her anymore. The biggest victory wasn't leaving the house or watching Evelyn's perfect image slowly disappear. The real victory was finding my own voice again. I learned that self-respect doesn't always arrive with a dramatic moment. Sometimes it comes quietly, through small decisions made when no one is watching. I built a new routine in my apartment. I filled the rooms with things I actually loved. I spent time with people who didn't make me question my value. I focused on my career, my friendships, and the parts of myself I had ignored while trying to fit into someone else's idea of a perfect wife. Daniel and I continued speaking occasionally. He started therapy and began understanding how years of silence had affected our marriage. Whether we eventually find our way back to each other or remain separate. I know one thing for certain, I will never again accept a relationship where my feelings are treated as a burden. As for Evelyn, I no longer carry anger toward her. That surprised me the most. I used to think revenge meant making someone feel the pain they caused. But peace taught me something different. The strongest revenge is becoming someone they can no longer control. Someone who walks away without needing their approval. That anniversary dinner wasn't the night I destroyed a family. It was the night I stopped destroying myself to protect one. Looking back, I realized the most powerful moment wasn't when I stood up at that table. It was when I finally understood that my worth was never determined by where someone else told me to stand.